Now we come to my absolute favorite data type in any language, which is the JSON object. So JSON is an acronym for JavaScript Object Notation. And in essence, a JSON object is a key value pair. It supports key value pairs where the values may themselves be other JSON objects. So to explain what that means, let's create a JSON object here. So it is another variable type, if you like. And in this variable A, we've used the curly braces, and we've been seeing curly braces used for code blocks up to now. But these curly braces, when used in this way, denotes that we are now creating an object of type JSON. And the key value pair is shown here. So when we create attributes of this, here's a key. So if we say B, and B is 10, and if we add another one, C is 20, then we have created an object B, which contains two elements, B and C. And attribute B has a value of 10 and attribute C has a value of 20. So if we console.log this variable A, then we can see here the variable A is an object. It's a JavaScript object, and it has attributes B, which is 10, and C, which is 20. And if you untwirl that, you can list it that way. We can, as I mentioned, have nested objects within that. So if we say var A equals, and let's keep the B and C. So B is 10 and C is 20. And now let's add D, which is itself another JavaScript object. And D has attributes D1, 50, and D2, 60. So this is a higher order object, if you like. It's an object with another object inside of one of the attributes. So if we run this, or if we console log this, console.log A, then we can see here B and C are the same, but D we can see is an object. And if we untwirl this, we can look into that. So we can see D is an object which has the sub attributes D1 and D2. And I've been using integers just for simplicity, but you can have any type of value in on the value side. So you can have strings, and as we saw, you can have objects. You can have lists or arrays as well, or sets. And so we can see that's valid. And so you can have extremely sophisticated objects, and you can go as deeply nested as you like. So D1 and D2 can have also objects or lists and their children as well. So we start to use those terms, right? We can think of B, C, and D as child attributes of the parent A, and D1 and D2 are child attributes of D, or D1 and D2 are grandchild attributes of A. So it's in essence a tree of attributes. Right, so that's the JavaScript object notation. And it's really useful because it allows you to write quite expressive code. So in contrast to the case where we have to define a variable to access the value, we can access any of these sub-attributes by referencing them using the dot notation. So we can say here console.log a.b, and if we run that, then you can see this is 10, right? That is pointing to this value. So when we read this line of code, we immediately know what we are referencing. We know that we are pointing to object A and we want attribute B. And we can go as deeply into this as we want. So if we say, for example, console log d1, d.d1, then that also works, right? So there's your 50. That's the value of D1, which is in sub-object D, which is in overall object A. So that's how you reference values in a JavaScript object. Let's see. And by the way, I did forget to point this out when we were talking about arrays, but if you wanted one of the elements of an array, so in this case, we've got a.c, so a.c, and if we wanted the second element of C, then remember indexing starts at 0, so the second element would be element 1. And so we can reference elements in an array using the square brackets and listing the index. And so a.c1 should give us a 20. And that's what we get here, right? So that's how we can reference elements of an array. I had also forgotten earlier to mention how to add elements to a set. So let's just, you can say here, if that's a set, then to add an element to a set, you say a.add. And if you add a 5 here and log that out, you can see here, we now have the 5 added on. So for sets, you add, right? For arrays, you push them in. For sets, you add them on. And for arrays and sets, you can reference specific elements using the square bracket notation there. And then for JavaScript objects, you can mix types as much as you want. You can have as deeply nested objects as you want, and you can reference them using the dot notation. You can also reference elements using the square brackets notation. And so if we say A, and here, if we want to reference attribute D, then we use a string D like that. So if we say console.log that, then for D, we expect to see the object D1, D2. So there we go. So we've accessed the attribute D in A using this. And this can be useful when the attribute names are stored in a variable. So sometimes when we do complex iterations over our objects, the attribute names might be stored in variables. So that's when the square bracket notation becomes useful. Looking in my notes here, we can also access the attribute names if we use the object.keys method. So we can say here console.log and then object.keys A. So if we run that, you can see the keys of A. We can see in A we have B, C, and D. Right? And we know that in D there are other keys, but we didn't ask for those. So when we reference object.keys, it's going to look in the immediate vicinity of A. It's going to look for the immediate children of A. It's not going to list all the sub-children or the grandchildren and so on. Just the immediate children of A are referenced by object.keys. So as we saw earlier, the array static type that for JSON objects, we also have the object type. So this is the object type, and we can access its methods using that object static type. So we can access the keys of A in this way. We can also access the values. So object.values of A, and if you look here, we can see this is 10 is our first element on the value side, or first attribute, the value of the first attribute. The value of the second attribute is actually an array, 10, 20, 30, and the third value is an object. So there's the object. So keys and values. So a JavaScript object is a key value pair. Now, one of the things we may want to do after, let's say we've created a big and sophisticated JavaScript object, maybe we want to stash that in a database somewhere, or let's say we just want to save it to a text file or something like that. Then there's an easy way to convert this object into a string. And that's using the JSON keyword. So if we say JSON.stringify, and then we reference the object itself, then it will stringify, it will create a string out of that object. So we can console.log that string. If we run that, you can see now there's a string here, and it's storing the string in a specific format. So number one, it's listing all the attribute names, all the keys, using the double quotes on those. And so it's not using the shorthand, right? This is considered shorthand. It's possibly a bad practice because sometimes the keys have spaces or weird characters in them. Of course, you should avoid doing things like that, but I often use the shorthand because I know I avoid using special characters. But when you JSON.stringify, it will not assume that you have clean attribute names. It will just use the double quotes for all the attribute names. So double quotes for the attribute name, and then you can see the values for those there, right? So all those, and in here, you can see the sub object. And of course, it's using the curly braces to denote that it's a JSON object. And again, it's using double quotes for the attribute names. So this is a valid JSON string. And so that's going from an object to a string. You can also convert a string back to an object. And so if we say JSON.parse, right, P-A-R-S-E. So if we want to parse a string, and let's say we create the string here. So let's create a string, and let's actually induce an error. So if I say A is 10 and B is 20, then let's see what that gives us. And you see it gives an error here. And this error is not that specific. It doesn't say exactly what the problem is. It says it's because there's some problem near that closing bracket. But the problem here is that we haven't used the double quotes. So when you do parse a string, you have to be quite careful to use double quotes for your attribute names. And so we can't use a double quote enclosing the whole string. So remember, we could specify strings using either double quotes or single quotes. And that's because quite often we want to reserve the double quotes for something like a JavaScript object or something else. And so we use single quotes to say what's coming up is a string. And then within that string, we want to specify the attributes in these double quotes like this. So this one should work. Let's see. Right, well, we've just passed it. So we want to console.log that as well. Right, so let's see what that looks like. So yeah, we do get a JSON object like that. Right, so that's how you can stringify or de-stringify or parse our JSON objects. And just checking the notes. Well, another thing we can do with our JSON objects is add to our attributes by reference. So I'm just going to comment out these statements. And then, so we currently have this object. We can add attributes to this by referencing. So we can say a.e equals 50. So if we add that and we console.log a, then we can see we do now have the additional attribute e. And in addition to the base times, right, Booleans, integers, floats, and strings, we can even introduce functions. So if we say a.f equals function, and let's say this receives two values, x and y, and returns the sum. So return x plus y. Then if we log out A, the object A, we can see here we've got those types of objects, and we do also have an attribute which is actually a function here. And we can use that function by referencing it as usual. So we can say console.log and then a.f, so that accesses the function. And if we put in here maybe 20, 10 and 20, then we expect to get a value of 30 here. So yeah, we've invoked the function f and passed it arguments 10 and 20. So 10 and 20 went in, and we got out 10 plus 20, 30 over there. So we can attach functions as attributes in a JSON object as well. So that's incredibly flexible. But please note that this doesn't stringify that well. So if we say console.log JSON.stringify A, then we can see the attributes which are not functions, those have been stringified, but the attribute f, which is a function, that hasn't been stringified here. There are ways to stringify a function, but I would say it's not worth doing for JSON objects. So probably if you want to store strings for JSON objects, you want to restrict that to attributes. And then we may cover in a future video how to stringify a function, and then you can write your own stringify method. You don't have to use the JSON one. You can write your own stringify method to stringify the function and add it into the other strings for the attributes of that object. One other thing to mention is that you can create JSON objects on the fly. Let's create another variable. So let's say var z equals 10. And then if we say console.log and then curly brackets and just z, then this will be interpreted in JavaScript as that we want to create a new object with the attribute z, and we must look for the value of z, which we will assign on the value side of this. So writing it this way is a very shorthand notation. It's super convenient for many things, but we are doing two things by specifying the z in here. So number one, we are specifying the name of the attribute, and number two, we are referencing the value for the variable which happens to have the same attribute name. So if we log that out, we can see we do have an object now which has attribute z of value 10. So that's a shorthand that's often quite useful in our code. And that's it, JavaScript object notation. I hope you'll become as much of a fanboy of it as I am.